This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 165 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we're going to learn how to set up mastery-based grading in your classroom. I have had Kareem Farah on my podcast 3 times in the last year. That should tell you how highly I regard what he's doing in education. Along with his team at the Modern Classrooms Project, Farah has developed an instructional system that came along at exactly the right time, even though he was working on it long before the pandemic hit. Here's a very simple description of the system. Students work through course curriculum at their own pace, only moving on when they've reached a certain level of mastery. The direct instruction is primarily delivered through screencast videos, which frees the teacher up to work one-on-one with students, build relationships, give timely feedback, and continue to refine and plan instruction. This episode is the third and final part of a 3-part series. The first was episode 144, where we learned how to make good quality screencast videos, the building blocks for this kind of instruction. Then in episode 158, he taught us how to set up a self-paced classroom. In that episode, he answered lots of questions teachers often have about this kind of system, like how to prevent one student being way ahead and another being way behind. In today's episode, we wrap the whole thing up, looking at how to grade students for mastery. In other words, not just letting them move on to the next thing before they've reached an acceptable level of mastery with the thing they're on. This is an essential piece of running a self-paced classroom. If you're thinking this sounds like standards-based grading, you're partially right, but in a lot of ways it's simpler than some standards-based systems. Also, if you work in a school that does traditional grading like many teachers do, and you're thinking mastery-based grading couldn't possibly work for you, I urge you to give this episode a listen. Farah and his team at Modern Classrooms Project work primarily with teachers in schools that do grading in very traditional ways, and they have all made it work beautifully. If you're interested in learning more about the Modern Classrooms approach, check out their free course by going to cultofpedagogy.com/modern. Before we start the interview, I'd like to thank Hapara for sponsoring this episode. Google and Hapara are better together. The Hapara Instructional Management Suite streamlines Google's G Suite for Education to create a seamless teaching and learning experiences for one-to-one classrooms, remote learning, and hybrid models. Teachers love it because it simplifies teaching workflows and helps students organize themselves for learning. It makes giving formative feedback quick and easy, automates and helps you track differentiation, keeps kids safe online, and gives them reminders to turn in their Google Classroom assignments. To find out more about how you can use Hapara at your school, visit hapara.com/cultofpedagogy. That's HAPARA.com/cultofpedagogy. Support also comes from Kidam. If 2020 taught us anything, it's that the tools and routines that have traditionally powered classrooms need more flexibility. If it taught us another thing, it's that piecemeal online tools cannot replace a well-designed, quality curriculum. So how to maintain both flexibility and quality? Is that too much to ask? At Kidam, they don't think so. The Kidam education platform houses curriculum, instruction, and assessment in one place, and they partner with top-rated curriculum publishers like Open Up Resources, Fish Tank Learning, and Illustrative Math through Kendall Hunt. So schools and districts can deliver the highest quality digital curriculum on Kidam's flexible platform and continue teaching in any environment. Educators love their teacher-friendly platform with options to engage in discourse online or in person. And students love Kidam for how easy it is to see their assignments and complete their work interactively. Choose from their curriculum menu or import your existing curriculum to bring it to life with Kidam. Request a demo today at teach.kidam.co/pedagogy. That's teach.kidam.co/pedagogy. Now here's my interview with Kareem Farah about mastery grading. I am excited to welcome Kareem Farah to the podcast for a 3rd time. Kareem, welcome back.
It is a joy to be here, Jennifer. How are you?
I'm great. I was just, as I was getting our materials together, I was remembering finding you online, I guess a little less than a year ago, and watching videos of you and saying to a friend of mine, I've got to get this guy on my podcast. And now here we are, only, about 8 months later, and this is the third time. So I have a strong belief in what you're doing.
I'm so excited. It's also amazing how much has happened since we first had our first
Oh my
interaction.
gosh.
I
I
mean,
know,
when we
right?
first connected, there was like 1,000 people in our free course at the Modern Classrooms Project, and we're now at 23,000. So,
Oh, wow.
so much has transpired, partially thanks to you. So, I have been glad to kind of be able to also really do a deep dive into all these different elements of the model that we've created, because you kind of create a venue on your blog in particular to really go deep into ideas. So it's actually
Yeah.
been a joy to write these out and then discuss each core component. So very
Yeah.
excited.
These are, I feel like each one of these is like a mini course. So what we have for anybody listening who's maybe coming in new or hasn't listened to the other two episodes, we started, well, let's start off by just explaining a little bit about your background and what you were doing before and what you're doing now and how that happened, just sort of briefly.
Totally. I'm going to keep it as
Okay.
brief as possible. So
Okay.
I was an educator for years. Spent my first 3 years in the classroom teaching very traditionally, wasn't leveraging technology.
And
Was
it
a
was
high
math, right?
and it was a high school math teacher.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Stood at the front of the room and lectured for too much time about
Mm-hmm.
concepts that a lot of times my students just were struggling with.
Yeah.
Decided to rethink teaching and learning, started building my own instructional videos, letting kids work at their own pace and grading students on mastery. At the time, had no idea I was building a model. I just was trying to figure out how to better meet students' needs, particularly in environments with a high diversity of learning levels, high levels of truancy, and a ton of trauma that my kids were experiencing.
Mm.
Later found out that I had a living and breathing instructional model, a blended self-paced, mastery-based approach to teaching and learning that looked quite different than what was out there. In particular, we were providing like a actionable blueprint for how teachers could change their classrooms that wasn't theory-based, but was actually built around core principles, constraints, templates, tools that folks could actually use and execute in their classroom. So we built the Modern Classrooms Project, which is a nonprofit that's designed to support educators in learning and rolling out our model in their own classrooms. And folks learn our model through our free course. They also learn it through our virtual mentorship program. And that's where we are today.
Got it. Got it. So that's the Modern Classrooms Project. And we'll remind people at the end of this, of that. And plus, I'm going to have it all on. You've got a blog post that you've written about what we're talking about today. So there are going to be links to everything everywhere. But just, I'm going to sort of paraphrase what you're doing to make sure that I'm understanding, and also just for listeners to make sure that they're getting it too. It's, you're setting up a self-paced classroom where students work through the material at their own pace. They are graded on mastery, and that system is built primarily around that you've delivered a lot of the materials through a blended learning format, which is done with a lot of screencast videos, basically.
That's exactly right.
Correct?
That's
Okay,
exactly right.
so that's what makes this part three. So part one, we talked about actually making good videos for a blended learning environment. The second thing we talked about was how to actually set up the self-paced aspect of this. And now to wrap up this three-part sequence, we're going to talk about the grading piece, the mastery grading. And teachers can use any of these pieces on their own, but they work really beautifully together.
That's exactly right. And this is the final frontier. I mean, we built this
Mm-hmm.
model to get to this stage, right? Truly
Right.
cultivating a world where we could grade students on mastery.
Right. So, why don't you start by just explaining what mastery based grading is? And then we're going to talk about why it's such a good thing.
Yeah, what's interesting about mastery-based grading is the concept is so logical, that explaining what it actually means is almost obvious to folks at
Yeah.
times. But because we rarely do it in classrooms, even though we certainly should, it is a surprise to folks. I mean, at its core, mastery-based grading is just the simple idea that students have to get a certain level of competence on one skill or task before moving on to the next. And the easiest way to understand this is to be able to sprint, you have to have mastery in how to walk. And
Hmm.
that is essentially what mastery based grading is. And the logic of it kind of speaks to why it's so incredibly important as we think about pushing student learning, over time.
Right. In the post that you're writing about this, you sort of outline some of the reasons why it's preferable to the way that we do things now. So why don't you go through some of those reasons?
Yeah, I mean, the first is the prevention of lingering skill gaps. And I kind of talk about this impact in two ways. One, it's infuriating as educators to try to teach complex content when students have so many lingering skill gaps that create barriers to entry. As
Hmm.
a math teacher, this was incredibly challenging, right? You're trying to teach like polynomial expressions with fractions and variables in the numerator and the denominator, but students are clearly struggling with the core idea of what a fraction is. It's very difficult to really push student mastery on that complex skill if they don't understand the foundational skill. And
Right.
part of the way that we fix that is to reinforce mastery based grading in every single classroom. So students are actually investing in the idea that they truly need to master the skills. And then we as teachers know that when we send them off to the next class, they've actually mastered what we taught them. So that when they continue to move on and continue on their academic journey, those skill gaps that have existed for years and only widen over time will start to get filled. So
Yeah.
it ensures that our students are better prepared for the future and also ensures that the students we get moving forward are better prepared for our classrooms. So
It's funny because teachers, we when we talk to each other, we almost talk as if we assume mastery-based grading has been happening. Because I can't tell you the number of times I've sat with a group of seventh grade teachers and listened to them say, "What the heck did they teach them in sixth grade and in fifth grade?" And everyone's saying that about the grade before. But because we don't do mastery-based grading, it's like, yeah, we covered this. The
exactly.
teachers will tell you we covered it, but that doesn't mean they learned it.
And as we're making those same complaints, which I remember doing year on year, someone's
Hmm.
obviously making the same complaint about our classrooms, right?
Exactly.
So it's this nasty pattern, right? Where like when we don't reinforce mastery, we're stuck trying to figure out what to cover and what not to cover, what can we feasibly
Yeah.
do in our classrooms. And ultimately, the people that suffer are the students, right? Because they're going on to the next classes with this sort of piecewise understanding of the prerequisite skills. It makes it really difficult for them to feel successful
Right.
at its core, which also connects to what I would argue is actually the far more important benefit of mastery
Hmm.
based grading, which is building student confidence and ultimately self worth.
Yeah.
When we're having those discussions in faculty lounges about, what did they teach them? The kids are not oblivious to that reality, right? They know ultimately
Mm.
that they're going into the next class with minimal understanding on certain skills. They're having trouble accessing new content. They're getting frustrated. They're expressing that. Now, over time, that has real damaging impacts on students' sense of self worth. If every single time I take a course, I sort of understand the material, don't really understand the material, have trouble retaining the material, I start to wonder like, can I be successful in a classroom? Can I be successful in an academic setting? It's also why we start to hear kids over time say things like, I'm bad at math, I'm bad at
Yeah.
history, I'm not a good writer. It's because they haven't been given the time or the space to actually master the skills. And they've started to actually be conditioned to think that they can't master skills.
Right.
And that's a really dangerous frontier to go down with students. And it's no surprise that it's our students who are farthest from opportunity who are the quickest to start to ask these questions about themselves.
Mm.
And then there's a third piece I often try to bring up to with regards to sort of preparing students for mastery and like why mastery is important. And it's really preparing them for the real world. One of the things, and Jennifer, remind me what grade you had taught when you were in the classroom.
Seventh and eighth grade English language arts.
So you know this as well because you were teaching middle school. But one of the things I always felt uncomfortable with was if I wasn't reinforcing the importance of mastery, instead just being like completion's fine, just try really hard, you're going to be great, you're going to be successful.
Yeah.
That's sort of like selling those false promises. All
Yeah.
we're doing is ensuring that kids get blindsided in the real world. Like we know that the real world in the job setting at a 2 year or 4 university, like you have to master skills, you have to execute, and there's
Hmm.
way less forgiveness when you
Hmm.
don't actually understand and execute. So I
Right.
often realize, and I learned this after my first years in the classroom, that I'm actually doing an enormous disservice when I don't hold my students to mastery. I'm actually
Mm.
sending them the message that it's okay to just try really hard and get some completion grades and they'll be fine. And then when we don't have the support systems and safety nets that our schools provide, they get totally blindsided and they express a lot of frustration that they feel misled. So, in some
Mm.
ways, it's almost our responsibility to ensure that we send the right message to our students that when they leave our buildings, mastery is what they're actually going to be held to, whether they like it or not. And we need to reinforce that reality now before it's too late, ultimately.
Right. Right. So, um, one of the things that you talk about next, actually, in the post is just about how, in order to do mastery based grading, you have to actually have self paced learning in place. And I think this sort of addresses the main question that I think a lot of teachers probably have, which is that how am I supposed to enforce mastery or expect mastery when my kids have different ability levels? Does that mean that everybody sort of sits around and waits for everybody else to catch up to where they are? Or, how does this all work? So what do you have to have in place in order to do mastery based grading?
Yeah, I mean, like anything in education, there just isn't a silver bullet. And the reason that folks
Mm,
don't implement mastery at scale is in mastery based grading at scale is not because they don't want to, but because that fundamental constraint of fixed pacing. If every
right.
kid has to go to lesson 2 tomorrow, no matter what, then of
Mm,
course it's impossible to actually hold students to mastery because I have a diversity of learning levels. Some kids aren't even there on that day, and I'm just going
yeah.
to teach the next thing no matter what. So ultimately, and this is what the research supports, you have to create a learning environment that certainly adjusts pace, ideally creates elements of self pacing to empower you as the educator and the student to really invest in this notion of mastery based grading. You have to have the capacity, simply put, to tell a student, you haven't mastered the skill yet, you're still working on it, and tell a student right next to them, you're good to go on the next lesson. If
Mm-hmm.
you can't do that, then you'll never really be able to invest in this idea. And what I want to stress to listeners is when I say self pacing, I don't mean like just this unregulated, endless amount of self pacing where kids are on lesson like 143 sitting next to another kid who's on lesson 12. In
Right.
our classroom, and what I outlined in the previous piece is this idea of self pacing within each unit of study, creating
Yes.
structure around that, really having guardrails, right? We're going to learn these 5 lessons over the course of these 10 days. You have deadlines for each of those lessons. You have summative assessments planned, right? So it's self pacing with clear guardrails and structure that
Mm-hmm.
gives you the freedom to actually let students spend more time on any given lesson they need to and less time on others that they can move forward on.
Right. And that's for people who are listening on the podcast, that is episode 158, where we really go deep into this idea of how do you actually manage the time. And it's such a relief when you sort of lay out how to do this. It's nice because I think, and just, to give away a little bit of the sort of key secret or the key ingredient here is that not everybody masters everything at 100%. You sort of establish kind of a baseline that everybody has to get to at least this level, and some go above it and others move on past that after that point.
That's
Is
right.
that right? Yeah.
That's right. I mean, what I tell folks, I said this in a presentation just yesterday. Like, if you have a student who's quote unquote testing at a fourth grade math level, sitting next to a student who's testing at a ninth grade math level in the same class,
Yeah.
it's just ridiculous to think that those two kids can learn the exact same amount of content at the
Right.
exact same level of mastery in the same amount of time. So ultimately, what I think that piece will outline is the structures you can create to ensure that both of those students feel pushed, you hold them both to mastery, and they both get the time they need to achieve success.
Right. Right. Okay, so what if assuming that somebody has already kind of got the self-pace piece down, then yeah, talk us through, what happens next? Like what does the mastery grading look like?
Yeah, so we often describe it in two core stages, right? You have the
Mhm.
developing mastery phase, and then you actually have the demonstration phase. And I
Okay.
think it's important to distinguish between those two buckets because a lot of times folks get lost in the theory around mastery based grading and forget the fact that still the large majority of the student experience is this developing phase, which is just practice, right? This
Mhm.
is when kids are just applying what they learned. They're engaging in discussions. They're doing labs or in readings. They're doing worksheets. This is when
Mhm.
they're literally figuring out what this skill is, how it
Yes.
works, and how it's applied. This is also the time when it's collaborative, right? You're not holding kids to this expectation like they have to suddenly perform perfectly. The assumption is you are developing at the moment. So you're going to hit roadblocks. You're going to get things wrong. You're going to lean on your peers. You're going to lean on your teacher. We're going to have small group and individualized discussion. This is
Mhm.
the large bulk of the learning experience. It's also the part that, frankly, is the most fun, right? Every teacher enjoys the most this element of the learning experience.
Yeah.
And
How do these active I mean these sound like different kinds of activities that I'm assuming are all set up that the students could do alone or with their peers without the teacher having to conduct it for them. But I'm assuming the teacher has to have it all in place at first.
Totally. Mastery-based grading is done best when you have your entire unit mapped out, ideally on a learning management system, right? So I'm a
Okay.
student, I might watch my instructional video that I've created. I then access the practice phase. The practice phase could be an individualized assignment largely where you just lean on your peers when you have questions. There could be
Mm-hmm.
collaboration elements baked in, right? Find a
Mm-hmm.
partner and work on this task, find a partner and work on this lab, right? So, but the key, as you indicated, is you want to have all those parts in place, kind of planning backwards, and UBD is really powerful when you're thinking about mastery based
Mm-hmm.
grading because you
Mm-hmm.
want to not be anxious about the fact that some kids might actually just be moving ahead and they're going to be
Right.
on mastery check or kind of showing their mastery on lesson 4 and another kid on lesson 2. So it's critical to have the materials planned in advance.
Okay. And so again, for people listening who are starting to feel like overwhelmed, it, I think, and you and I have even talked about this, this is something that people tend to implement maybe over the course of like 3 years because they can't necessarily get an entire year all together at once.
Mhm.
So they might change up maybe 2 or 3 of their units over the course of one year, and then the next year shift a few more, and then finally they've got everything kind of ready.
That's right. And I mean, the best implementers of this model, and in particular this mastery based grading approach, usually work on every unit having the full unit plan in advance. They have a clear day that they know, like unit 3 is launching on Monday. I got to
Yeah.
have this whole thing uploaded on my learning management system so that when that day launches, I'm good to go for that unit. So that's the goal.
Yeah.
And as you said, some folks who feel like that's kind of daunting, they're going to
Yeah.
pick unit 3, 5, and 7 to do it this way. And
Yeah.
then next year, those are already planned, right? So they have to fill in the gaps with the other units.
Right, right. It seems too like this would be a great thing for a team of teachers to work on because then a few of you can work on one unit and a few of you can work on it. If everyone's on board and understands the concept, then you could probably get to the end of this a lot quicker than just trying to do it on your own.
Totally. And folks do this in a couple different ways. In some cases, what they'll do is they'll alternate lessons within a unit to plan. So I'm
Mhm.
planning lessons 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, and my fellow English teacher at 6th grade is going to do the other ones. And then I've also seen examples where they alternate units, right? So you
Right.
actually have a nice on ramp. I'm planning units 1 and 3. So when I'm done
Mhm.
with 1, I have a whole month and a half to get my
Mm.
materials ready for unit 3 because my other teacher who teaches the same content area is taking care of unit 2. And
Yeah.
that can be a really powerful way to do this. And we've seen the upside of that many a times with
Yeah.
educators across the country.
So students are, they're being introduced to the material, then they're working on various activities to apply their learning.
Mm-hmm.
And then so this is that first stage, which is just the practice. And one of the things you mentioned in the post is that this is the majority of class time is spent in the practice phase.
Yes. And
Okay.
one thing I stress to folks is you have to create a culture of revision in the practice phase.
Mm,
And you should create common understanding about what constitutes a revision. So,
okay.
for example, in my class, students would always go to the practice phase, and the practice phase would be scored out of 10. And if a
Okay.
student did not get 80% of the practice phase right, they were going to be revising. They were not ready to demonstrate their mastery. And I would construct each practice activity depending on what it looked like to ensure that kids understand here's how you get your points. And if you're not getting to an 8, you haven't actually demonstrated full mastery. And every educator does this differently, right? They
Mm-hmm.
figure out what constitutes mastery on a particular assignment and what prompts them to then revise that assignment. But really creating a structure around that then ensures that you can point kids to why they're having to revise and what the
Mm-hmm.
actionable feedback is. And it creates a real powerful environment in the classroom where kids understand I don't demonstrate mastery unless I'm ready. Because part of the reason kids are so fearful of assessments is because they're so often actually going into assessments unprepared. It really is
Mm-hmm.
not pleasant to go give a presentation when you're unprepared to give the presentation. It's actually
Mm-hmm.
horrifying. Same
Mm-hmm.
thing for a test, right? Kids most anxious about tests walk in there thinking like, I don't know most of this content. So you want to reinforce the notion to kids that you should expect to revise any assignment or practice maybe multiple times. And the reason you're doing that is you're building the skills, you're flexing the muscles to make sure that when you get to the phase where you demonstrate your mastery, you're actually ready and you're excited for it.
Okay, I've got a question for you about revision
Mhm.
because as an English teacher, I'm very familiar with what revision would look like in my class with, say, a narrative writing piece or something like that, or even if we're working on a particular skill in writing. What I'm wondering though, I'm thinking about some of the assignments I've seen my kids bring home over the years, and a lot of them are just simply supplying the correct answers to
Yep.
questions. So I'm thinking with those types of assignments, there really isn't any revision. It's them finding out what the right answers were, and it's almost like assignments are designed as mastery checks as opposed to, do you know what I'm saying? Like, I
Totally.
think in order for a teacher to be able to function in a system like that, they have to be used to giving a certain kind of assignment that isn't just worksheets, basically.
Well, and I can give you an example of how it can be done with a worksheet. I think there's two things that are critical that need to happen when you are teaching a class where there's a fair amount of worksheets. The most
Okay.
common example of this is a math class, right? You got math
Okay.
classes, kid learns how to add fractions, then they have to, solve 12 problems where they're adding fractions.
Right.
The first thing you want to ensure is that you obviously demand, and this often happens in STEM classes, for students to show their work, right? You need to see the thought process that comes out.
Okay.
Ideally, there's even an explanation of their work. This is
Mhm.
how I did this. The
Okay.
second piece is there's a gut reaction that oftentimes teachers have when they're correcting work to not just identify which questions are not right, but then
Mhm.
to give the analysis of what's wrong. So you've basically done the revision for the kid, right? If I circle problem number 4 and say, your denominator's off, and then I indicate that to the student, well, you've actually done the revision. They go back, change the denominator, and they're done. What I
Right.
often did when I had a worksheet style is I would have a highlighter out and I would simply just highlight the problems that had
Mhm.
errors. And I'd say, look, you're making a general common mistake around these 3 principles on this lesson. I've isolated the 4 problems that you've
Mhm.
made that type of error on. Go figure it out. If you're struggling with it, go lean on a peer who's already been successful on this or who's currently working on it. So I
Mhm.
intentionally leave the actual solution to the problem open so that the kid can go actually engage in the revision. So part of the art of doing revision effectively in courses that aren't, based around paper writing is actually just not giving them too much information about what they've done
Okay.
wrong and empowering them to go find the problem itself.
Okay. So when they go, this is really helpful. When they go to the peer, I've seen this especially this year that kids will do the most efficient thing. What is stopping them from just going to the peer and saying, "What is number 7?" And when they come back to you, how do you ascertain whether they've really learned it or just found the correct answer from a peer?
This is such a good question because it actually speaks to the importance of the next stage, which
Okay.
is when kids actually understand that the next stage is demonstrating mastery.
Mm.
They know that what they just did gets them nowhere. And you
Right.
actually want kids to learn that the hard way. So I
Okay.
loved when kids would do what you just described, right? I give them
Okay.
the worksheet, highlights problem 3, 5, and 7. You didn't get those right. You need to figure out what's wrong with them. They go to a peer, give me the answer. They scribble it down, turn it. I'm like, great, cool. Now you're on stage 2, the
Mm.
mastery check. You have to independently, ideally in a separate portion of the room, answer a short bite-sized assessment where you demonstrate your understanding of the skill. You no longer can lean on your peer. You maybe can have it open note or not. That's usually teacher discretion. It's at this
Mhm.
stage where the student's actually showing you and themselves that they've actually mastered the skill. Now, if
Mm.
they overly leaned on a peer, if they don't
Mhm.
actually understand what's going on, they're going to bomb the mastery check.
Right.
And it leads to some of the most powerful discussions I've ever had in a classroom. A lot of times in the example that you actually just described, I take that student's practice and then I take their mastery check and I put them side by side and I say, can you explain to me why you totally couldn't figure out the mastery check, but you seem to have the practice done perfectly? And they have to articulate, well, Tommy walked me through lessons 3, 5, and 7. And we have a
Uh-huh.
discussion about the fact that, well, if Tommy just walks you through it and you don't understand, and then you come to me and say, I'm ready for the mastery check, you're setting yourself up for failure. You're actually wasting your own time because now you have to do a
Yes.
revision and a reassessment, and you're certainly not improving your grade. Those conversations were missing in my classroom before I started doing mastery based grading, right?
Right.
Kids could actually just copy, turn in, completion grade, effort grade, partial credit grade. And this would continue on until they took the summative, and then they might do really poorly on the summative, and I'd
Mhm.
be confused as to why. So part of the reason why kids start to revise their work effectively and collaborate effectively is because there's common understanding that they're going to have to demonstrate their mastery on their
Right.
own very soon.
Fantastic. I love this. Yeah, I've been pushing more and more the idea of, and I think this has been to reduce grading. A lot of teachers give tons and tons of assignments that they give points to, and there's a ton of grading and recording. And I keep pushing out this idea of let's do something that looks more like practice, 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 graded assignment, practice, 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 graded assignment, so that you're only grading those two things.
That's right.
And the kids they're learning this stuff, but in the classroom culture, they have to understand that all these practices are leading to that bigger grade.
That's right. I mean, just look at any skill that we learn as human beings, right? If you're learning how to drive a car, like you're not getting evaluated on your practice of driving the car. The reason why you're invested in learning how to drive the car is because once you're by yourself driving that car, if you haven't mastered that skill, you got real problems.
Yeah.
And ultimately, we want kids to internalize that same idea around practice and the bulk of the learning experience for any skill. Like you're learning
Right.
this skill because you have to demonstrate it and use it. It's coming around the corner. You're going to invest in doing this right and using your time effectively and asking your peers to explain how they did something productively and not just giving you answers because you know you have to
Mm-hmm.
demonstrate it down the road. My favorite moments in a mastery based setting is when you actually hear a kid go ask their peer, how do you do this? And they're like, just do this, this, and this. And they tell their peer, I don't understand. You went
Mm.
too fast. Can you actually
Mm-hmm.
explain this? Because I have a
Mm-hmm.
mastery check in 20 minutes and I can't figure it out yet. That's such a powerful moment, right? Because the kid's internalizing the notion that they actually have to understand something.
Right.
It's not
Right.
just a bunch of worksheets they're submitting.
Oh, and what a huge, huge contrast to what happens in a lot of classrooms right now.
Totally.
Mm.
Constantly, right?
Yeah.
Constantly.
So these mastery checks, you sort of outlined too, like kind of what they look like, and there are some key features of them that makes it a little bit easier to manage the amount of them.
Yeah. So, I mean, first, the first feature is ideally they're administered individually unless the
Hmm.
skill that's being evaluated is something that's collaborative, which happens often, like, for example,
Hmm.
in a foreign language class, like the
Hmm.
mastery check might include a conversation. So, generally they're administered individually. In other words, they shouldn't be able to lean on their peer. This is the
Yeah.
time for them to demonstrate what they know in a specific setting. One thing to note about that, too, is a lot of teachers, especially when you're in the in person setting, they have a mastery check zone in their classroom. It's an
Hmm.
actual area of their classroom that's
Mm.
silent. A lot of teachers will use colored paper for mastery checks so that you can
Hmm.
see very clearly a kid's on a mastery check, they shouldn't be
Okay.
talking. So that's
Right.
just components about making sure like you're managing the
Hmm.
experience correctly. Because if you're running a self-paced classroom, right, 5 kids at any given time might be taking mastery checks and they might be taking different ones. So you want to have very quick and easy ways to identify those 5 kids are taking those mastery checks. And if anything sketchy is going on, I can see it.
Got it.
The second piece is making sure that they're easily assessed, right? It's very, I had this problem as a math teacher. I think a ton of teachers have this problem. Like, we are so into our content, we know our content so well that we become lost in building like these really, really lofty assessments that like try to
Mm.
hit every single element of what's learned. If I teach kids a particular skill in math, there's like 7 different ways that skill manifests. And I feel this like need to actually show all 7 variations on an assessment. And if kids can't do all 7 variations, then they didn't master the skill. Like,
Yeah.
that's overkill. So what I
Mm.
tell folks is try to keep it bite sized. Ideally a kid can do this under 10 minutes, even under
Hmm.
5 minutes at best.
Hmm.
It helps to create simple templates. I link to one in the actual piece itself.
Okay.
1 or 2 questions, usually scaffolded up, right? You have one fairly digestible question, not particularly challenging, and then one that's a little bit tougher. You want to make sure also that those, mastery checks ensure that the student's actually explaining their thinking, whatever
Hmm.
content area or grade level, because you can get a
Hmm.
feel for what that looks like, so that you can grade it quite quickly. And a lot of folks will also just have standard rubrics for this, right?
Hmm.
Rubrics that are, scored on a 0 to 4 scale, on a 1 to 2 scale, whatever it may be, so that you can quickly take these mastery checks, grade them, very quickly isolate whether students gotten it right or wrong, also be able to isolate what about what they did is right or wrong,
Yeah.
and then be able to deliver that feedback for a reassessment. And one of the things that tons of educators do as well, and this kind of is content and grade level specific, is you actually build multiple forms of each mastery check. This works really well. Again, obvious in sort of your math and science settings, where if they're answering 2 problems, You then build two other versions of this with different
Yes.
numbers so that you can
Yes.
quickly, give the next one, right?
Got it.
And that's really powerful as well. In the humanities, it depends on the mastery check. Sometimes it doesn't actually make sense for someone to do an entirely different question. A good
Mm.
example I have is one of our awesome history teachers. One of their units, each mastery check was actually going to be an element of their final project, which is the writing piece. So
Mm.
the mastery check for lesson one was the topic sentence. So you
Got
don't
it.
want to tell the kid to go like reconstruct entirely from scratch a brand new topic sentence. Instead, you
Yes.
can say, hey, here's the problem. You need to go back and rewrite that topic sentence and make these adjustments. So that would still be a
Mm-hmm.
reassessment, but not doing an entirely new mastery check.
Got it. So, okay. So you've also outlined some pushback and some challenges of this system.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Tell us about those.
My favorite by far, and if you haven't learned from me yet, I kind of enjoy pushback because I tend to think that pushback usually means that something powerful is happening, sometimes powerfully wrong, but oftentimes powerfully positive.
Yeah.
And it's about our ability to actually hold true to our principles during that pushback that leads to some of the more transformational change. The first and a great example of this is student frustration. If your students aren't mad at you for holding them to mastery, they've probably been held to mastery before.
Mm.
You should expect students to be furious. When I first rolled this model out, particularly because when I first did this, I did this with 11th graders. They have had
Okay.
far
Ooh.
too many years of classroom instruction that didn't invest in the idea of mastery. So by the
Mm-hmm.
time I got them, they were conditioned to just turn in worksheets, get grades, pass the class, and keep it moving. So what you should expect from kids is this idea of like, why? Why are
Yeah.
you making me go back to this? I never used to revise assignments before. Why do I
Mm.
have to be reassessed? Why
Mm.
can't I just get a 5 out of 10? Right?
Yeah.
That idea is going to be expressed by your students, at some points, even yelled by your students.
Mm.
And what I always tell folks is the angrier they are about it, the more they need it. It is
Wow.
the greatest indication to all of us that this student has actually been conditioned to believe that mastering skills doesn't actually matter. And that should give us all chills because
Yeah.
when they leave our buildings, our classrooms, they're in store for a really, really harsh reality check. And I'd love to be someone who contributes to that not being so brutal now
Mm.
than it
Mm-hmm.
happening when, again, the safety nets are not there anymore. So
Yeah.
everyone needs to just expect that core idea of pushback from students and embrace it. And, I often would sort of like relish in those conversations because I knew that was some of the most transformational work that was happening in my classroom. Forget the content. This kid is actually learning right here, right now, the importance of developing mastery and the fact that to get there, you have to go back to work, tinker
Mm.
with it, revise it, and be reassessed. And if a kid can leave my classroom only mastering 2 math skills, but learning that idea, I probably have made a bigger impact on their life than the 57 math skills I was supposed to teach them in the
Yeah.
9 months that I had them.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's the student frustration I highlight, and is the one probably to be most prepared with. The second piece is folks tend to really have trouble managing or thinking about what their grade books look like
Mm.
in a mastery based grading setting. And I'm not actually sure why this particular pushback, where it came from. I think for some reason, and I'm not sure where this all was developed, but there's a lot of sort of theory and debate around standards based grading, mastery based grading, competency based grading. Like, I actually avoid a lot of these Facebook groups and message groups because it's so much theory and it's
Yeah.
really at times unproductive. I'm like, everyone's missing kind of like the more important idea here, which is this core idea that a student needs to understand a skill before doing the next one.
Right.
And I think some of those discussions also start to make people feel like their grade book has to be exclusively skill based, meaning like you don't have lesson one in your grade book. It says, I can add fractions. And that's just not true. You can use mastery based grading in a very standard grade book. The large majority, thousands of educators who use our model, use a very standard grade book. I use the glorious Aspen
Mm-hmm.
to do my grading. And the key distinction when you think about grading in the class is not how your grade book looks, it's actually how you treat each assignment. So it's this idea that I will not give anyone in my class under an 80% on any assignment. So once you adopt that idea, your grade book changes in that you don't see a bunch of partial credits. You don't see 50% and 40%. You either see hundreds, 90s, and 80% or zeros. And then reinforcing that notion to kids is the big shift. So I put in the piece like two examples that kind of show the back and forth between the
Mm-hmm.
exact same grade book, very standard, but one in a traditional setting and one in a mastery-based grading setting to kind of illuminate a little bit of what this looks like. But that's a common pushback as well.
Okay. And so I'm looking at these right now, and people really should just come and look at them. But it seems sort of like the main idea here is that they're going to redo them until they get to that 80% level.
That's right.
And then if they simply just don't, then they just get a zero.
That's right. And the simple way of thinking about this is if I got 5 lessons in a unit, do I want my kids to have a surface level understanding of all 5 or master 4 out of 5? My
Okay.
belief is master 4 out of 5. So in a grade book, you might see a student with a whole bunch of partial credit, 50s and 60s and 70% on all the lessons. And that is what a
Right.
traditional grade book would look like.
Yep.
You might open my grade book and see 80s, 90s, and 100% for 4 of the lessons, and then 2 big zeros because they never actually mastered lesson 5.
Right.
And that's okay. And one thing that is ultimately a teacher discretion question is what I always tell folks in a mastery based grading setting is if a student doesn't master all the skills in the unit timeline you've provided, I would always tell them, you no longer can work on this unit during class. But if you
Mm,
want to master these skills at home, you want to master them at lunch, you want to find another time to do it, fantastic, I will change your grade. You just no longer have the class period to do it because we all as a team are moving on to the next unit. And that
okay.
that is a really powerful way to reinforce to students that learning never stops.
Yeah.
Um, because you don't want to it's counterintuitive to say we're in a mastery based grading setting, but you lost your chance on lesson 5. So you want to give
Right.
them the on ramp and the opportunity to catch up and master those skills no matter what.
But what you're saying to that student is, this 82% that you got, this is pretty good mastery of some of the most important skills. But if you really want to keep going, you are going to have the opportunity to do that on your own time.
Right. And it's also
Okay.
a way, sometimes I get frustrated with some innovative approaches to teaching and learning that might take it a little too far and not prepare students for reality, right?
Mm,
If we live in a world where kids just have an endless amount of time to master anything and there's no sort of guardrails and structures, there's no
yeah.
summative assessments, like, is that really productive for someone who then has to go to college or the real
Mm,
world and
hmm.
has like clear deadlines that they need to meet? So
Right.
what that does is creates a nice balance of we want you to master skills, we want you to give the time and the space. But if I've outlined a ton of time for you and you weren't able to execute in that time frame, the only way to be able to catch up is to use time outside of class. It's
Right.
also a great rationale for homework, right? That's
Yeah.
purposeful homework. You need to go home and do something because in the allotted time you were provided, you didn't actually execute.
Got
So
it.
that's how we treat it. And I think it's a really powerful way to do it.
I think this seems like it would address another, not a misconception, but I can see a lot of teachers being introduced to the idea of mastery based grading and then thinking, okay, look, right now I've got these two kids. One of them works his butt off and gets like, B plus to an A. Another kid doesn't do crap, basically. Doesn't show up, doesn't turn work in, fools around a lot in class. You're telling me both of those kids are going to end up with an A because they both mastered some skills. So what you're showing me here is that no, that is not the case. Like the hard work still is rewarded. But and it's not just like, oh, hey, whatever you master, you're great. Everybody gets an A and, participation trophies for all.
And on top of that, can we actually have some concrete data on what the kid actually needs to work on? Because when I open up a grade book and the
Mm,
kid gets a C in a class and there's just a mixture of partial credit for every
mm,
assignment, what
mm-hmm.
exactly does the kid need to do to get better? I honestly couldn't tell you. And most teachers, I think,
Right.
feel that struggle as well. Because it's like, I don't know what to do because this kid's been struggling on every single assignment. So what they need to work on is just like math in general.
Yeah.
Whereas when you look at a mastery based grading grade book, you actually can isolate like it's lessons 3, 4, and 5. Like
Yeah.
that's what the kid needs to do. And if you
Right.
want to loop in an additional support system, maybe we have a counselor involved, a parent
Mm-hmm.
involved, a tutor involved. You can
Mm-hmm.
say, here are the lessons. They've mastered these ones, they have not mastered these ones. So it actually provides a sense of hope for students. They actually
Yeah.
have an on ramp. We talk about how pleasant parent conferences are with a model like this because you have a
Mm,
discussion with the parent. You say, look, Yeah, your student has a D plus right now. They've mastered 68% of the content. Here are the lessons they haven't mastered. By the way, they can still master them. And
Mm,
here's where they can access the content. Here's the actual assignments, the mastery checks. So this is what they're working towards. And if they're able to execute, their grade goes up. That clarity, like I always say, uncertainty for students and uncertainty for parents is the things that will make them most upset for good
yeah.
reason, right? Like
Yeah.
if I don't have any understanding of what to do next, then I'm mad, especially if my student's not, particularly successful at the moment in your class.
Yeah. Well, and it's fertile ground for making up your own reasons. This teacher hates me, or, it's, you can fill in the gaps if you're uncertain with all kinds of other horrible explanations for things.
Exactly. So the
Yeah.
greater clarity you have, particularly on how and why your students performing in a certain way, the more likely they're going to feel successful, and the more likely you are going to feel like you've actually given them what they need to achieve mastery, and that's
Mm.
the goal.
Have you personally, and then also within the community of all these teachers now that are doing this, has there been a trend of sort of kids being more motivated in general under this kind of system?
Uh, Absolutely. I mean, I
Okay.
think there's a portion of students that initially deflate.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Again, it's
Hmm.
sort of like those are the students that need this the most,
Yeah.
right? So the moment they realize that they actually have to learn the skills and master content, they might be just totally flustered and be like, how am I going to make it through this class? And it's those kids that need the most one on one and small group time, the most positive reinforcement. And when they make the shift, when they start to master skills, it's this glorious transition. And that's when you see this sudden increase in sort of self worth, right? A student for the first time is like, wait a minute, I actually understand this skill. It sort of exposes, right, what students have already been thinking for a while, and kind of brings it up and says, let's talk about it and let's address it. So,
Yeah.
in some ways, you see some kids that really struggle, but those kids, when they can make it through, truly have transformational shifts in the way they approach teaching and learning, which is really, really excited. On the flip side, you have a ton of kids who really thrive because of the clarity, right? They
Mm.
know what they should be doing next. They can create real plans for themselves. They can actually construct a to-do list that makes sense. You can really loop in other stakeholders in their life to be supportive of that environment. So the
Hmm.
large majority is positive. And really interestingly, we tend to hear a consistent trend. And I don't have like a report to show about this because it's kind of impossible to generate, but consistently declines and really poor grades, particularly failure rates. So we're finding that significantly less numbers of students in our classrooms fail their classes. And oftentimes we see students who are failing like over 50% of their classes, but
Mm.
the one they aren't is ours, right? One of our mastery based blended self paced structures,
Yeah.
because it's the one class where they feel like they have an on ramp to success. So a lot of really positive examples about how this can play out.
Awesome. Awesome. Um, the one last item I'm seeing here that we didn't quite get to is just this idea that teachers worry that they're going to struggle to actually keep up with grading, since there are, I guess, theoretically more mastery checks, although that doesn't necessarily have to be true. But talk about that a little bit.
Totally. So, I mean, it is mastery based grading. So,
Mm,
if you're going to do it, expect to grade and grade a fair amount.
mm-hmm,
It's part of the process. What I've always said, I used to say this, I think I said this in our previous podcast episodes about building screencasts. It's like I used to plan and feel like the more I was planning, I wasn't actually seeing any returns. Like it wasn't contributing to student learning better, and it certainly wasn't, making my time better.
mm-hmm,
I felt that way about grading until I started using mastery based grading. So one of the things that I tell everyone to do when they start to do this model is like try to throw away some of the preconceived notions you currently have about grading, because likely the way you've been grading up to this point has been miserable, incredibly
mm,
time consuming, and not all that productive to student learning. It's been a lot of like, I have a stack of 100 papers. I spend all my Sunday grading them. I then hand them back. Kids look at them for 10 seconds and then throw
yeah,
them away. And
yep,
I'm like, why the heck did I just spend all that time doing that? In
mm-hmm,
this model, you're giving that feedback very quickly, and the grading is incredibly purposeful. So, you want to reframe some of your common understandings around grading and realize the benefits of it through this model. And then there's some strategies that are just powerful to think about to reduce grading. So in particular, right, the place where you don't want to cut corners is the mastery check. You
mm-hmm,
have an actual backstop for every lesson. No matter what, a kid's going to take a mastery check, and you're going to be able to identify at that point in time whether the kids understood the skill. So a lot of folks that feel like they have too much grading will spot check the assignments, the practice. You kind of
mm-hmm,
alluded to this earlier. Maybe
mm-hmm,
just look at a couple questions, and also start to prioritize. So if I have a student who's consistently succeeding on the practice and then doing the mastery checks, I'm not all that worried they're going to give me a practice that isn't, well done or they haven't invested time in. If I have a student who seems to be leaning on their peers a little bit too much, sometimes, creating a gray line between copying and getting support, I
Yeah.
might watch their practices significantly closer to
Right.
see, to what degree they're using their time effectively. So the
Yeah.
practice grading is one where you can really, reduce the amount of time you spend on it and come up with sort of mechanisms to spot check so it isn't super overwhelming. It also ensures that you focus really, really hard on the mastery check because that's the powerful indicator each lesson that a student's actually mastered the skill.
Got it. Got it. So, I think our goal with this whole three-part series was that we would give teachers enough that if they wanted to just run off on their own and try it, they could. However, they have a much greater chance of success by coming to the Modern Classrooms project and taking advantage of one of two levels, basically, of support. So, talk about what you offer there, and let's also talk about what is free and what is paid, so people know they know what they're getting into.
Totally. So we're a nonprofit. One of
Hmm.
the beauties of a nonprofit is you don't hide information from the public
Hmm.
because you just seek to actually empower teachers to create a more powerful learning environment for their students. So every single tutorial and resource we have is in our free course. I
Okay.
strongly encourage educators who find this even remotely interesting to just go to our free course. You can access it on our website at modernclassrooms.org, or you
Hmm.
can just go directly to the free course at learn.modernclassrooms.org. It's
Hmm.
also linked in the piece. That is a
Hmm.
great place to start. It really takes a deep dive into the full model from start to finish, the rationale, the research, and then really granular tools, right? Templates for mastery checks, templates for how you actually build slides for a screencast, and everything in between. So I strongly encourage folks to start there. Now, a
Hmm.
number of educators then really want more comprehensive support. So when we hit the ground and running and said, look, if we're going to charge teachers for something, what are we going to create that's going to be meaningful for them? And we arrived at a mentorship program, a
Hmm.
virtual mentorship program, which takes that free course and basically puts it on steroids and adds a mentor. So
Hmm.
educators who enroll in that program get paired with an actual implementer of the model, likely in a similar grade level and content area. And that's your one on one support system as you actually submit real assignments and receive feedback. And during that journey, you're building 3 full modern classroom lessons. So you're creating instructional videos, guided notes, mastery checks, self pacing plans, receiving that one on one feedback, and getting on coaching calls. And just so
Awesome.
the world knows how this normally works, some folks enroll individually. They just purchase it. It's $500, $495.
Uh-huh.
But actually, most people are enrolling through this program through a school or district partnership. So
Okay.
they're communicating with their principal or their superintendents or directors of curriculum instruction saying, look, I'd love to get a cohort of teachers to
Mm.
travel through this virtual mentorship program with me. I think this could be a really powerful way to change the landscape of classroom instruction in our community. So, we often sign partnerships, of 100 teachers, 50 teachers, 20 teachers, 5 teachers who are all at the same school or community who want to travel through the program together and learn this innovative approach. And it's the same pricing structure. And
Okay.
around the corner, we have our big summer institute actually. So we're going to be training about 1,200 teachers through our virtual mentorship program starting at the end of June. So that's a popular time where folks do like to engage in that type of structure because they
Hmm.
have sort of the energy to, not have to manage their own classroom and plan something new.
You've got a community also. Is that a Facebook group or where does that live?
Totally. So I encourage folks to follow our social media channels. So we have a Facebook page. Our
Hmm.
Twitter account also provides updates because we have a teacher resources page on our website that shows you, like, we host webinars, we have our own podcast, we write pieces all the time. So there's a lot of literature and materials that come out there. And we often post all these things on our social media pages. So certainly follow our social media pages. They're at Modern Class Proj. So the
Hmm.
project is not fully spelled out. And then, as you said, there's a Facebook group that we moderate that currently has 3,500 teachers in it. It grows daily. And these are all educators, free course, virtual mentorship, everything in between, just chatting and sharing and
Got
learning
it.
about implementation.
That was what I was wondering. Can you get into the group just by having, being in the free course or whatever? That's not part of the mentorship program.
Not at all. It's
Got it.
totally open to anyone who wants to join and
Because I,
learn and
I
share.
think that would be a great place for people to go if they're still exploring this. Because to me, it seems like one of the most powerful things is looking at, okay, this person teaches 10th grade history. Like, how are they doing it? How's this third grade science teacher doing it? And then you can really start to see how it's working for people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People love that Facebook group, and I encourage folks to go there, and we'll make sure to have a link to it in the piece as well, so folks know how to get there.
Okay. And how's your capacity now? Because I think we talked maybe 6 months ago, and you guys were so overwhelmed with new interests that you couldn't even take new people yet. Has that been worked out?
Yeah, well, to some degree. So one of the cool things about our approach is our mentors are real teachers, right? So the more people who do our model, the more mentors we have. So our mentor capacity is only growing. If folks want to become a mentor, by the way, we have a Distinguished Modern Classroom Educator credential. It's basically a credential people can apply for if you're implementing our model, and you then become elevated, you get your own credential, and then you become eligible to become a paid mentor within our community.
Nice.
So that's how we've worked to increase our capacity. We have about, at this point, it's what, March 1st, March 2nd, and we have 75% of our Summer Institute full. So our capacity constraint is not done. We will continue to run up to capacity constraints, which is okay. But we're continuing to expand and grow. And it's the beauty of also having our free resources is even when we're full on capacity on mentoring, you always have our free resources, the Facebook group, the free course, the webinars to support you during this process as well.
Got it. Kareem, thank you so much for all of the work that you're doing. I think you're making a huge difference, and for coming on here and doing all these deep dives with me.
Of course, and thank you for having me. It's always a joy to chat, Jennifer, and the work that you do at Cult of Pedagogy is inspiring every day. We often have meetings internally about how we build such a powerful community of educators like you've done already, so it's been a privilege, and thank you for having me.
To read Kareem's blog post on mastery grading and find more information about the Modern Classrooms Project, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 165. To sign up for the free course at the Modern Classrooms Project, go to cultofpedagogy.com/modern. And to get a weekly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.